The case seemed simple when it first landed on my bench. A daughter claimed that her mother had used utility accounts connected to her name and left her with unpaid bills. The mother insisted everything had been voluntary. According to her, the daughter had willingly opened the account and even agreed to keep it active longer because she didn't want her mother sitting in the dark without electricity. At first glance, it sounded like a family misunderstanding. But after years in a courtroom, I've learned that family disputes are rarely that simple. As I listened carefully, a detail immediately caught my attention. The mother's husband had previously written a letter that seemed to tell a very different story. In that letter, it was clear that the daughter wasn't even living in the home when these utility accounts were being used. That detail mattered. It mattered a lot.
The mother tried to shift the focus back to how everything started. She wanted to talk about the period when her daughter first moved into her home. But I wasn't interested in the beginning anymore. The beginning wasn't where the problem was hiding. The problem was what happened later. By that point, the daughter wasn't living there. Yet somehow the utility account remained tied to her name while other people continued benefiting from the service. That was the moment I knew exactly where this was going. The daughter had eventually closed the account. That should have been the end of the story. But it wasn't. The account was reopened. Whenever I hear something like that, I ask myself a very simple question. How? Accounts don't magically reopen themselves. The explanation that followed was interesting. According to the mother, her daughter felt sorry for her.
She allegedly agreed to allow the account to remain active for a little while longer, until her mother's financial situation improved. Maybe that's true. Maybe it isn't. But even if I accepted that explanation completely, one fact remained impossible to ignore. The bills still existed. The debt still existed. And someone had to pay it. After reviewing everything in front of me, I came to a conclusion that wasn't particularly difficult. The daughter had been left carrying a financial burden that wasn't hers to carry. The amount was clear: $1,235. At that point, many people in the courtroom probably assumed the case was finished. It wasn't. In fact, the most surprising part was still ahead. The mother's husband had filed a counterclaim. He believed he was owed money connected to disability benefits he received while incarcerated. The moment that issue surfaced, the entire atmosphere changed. Now we weren't talking about utility bills anymore. We were talking about government benefits, prison time, and personal responsibility. I wanted answers. The first thing I learned was that he had spent 18 months incarcerated. He had also been receiving Social Security disability benefits for years. Then came the question that changed everything. Why was he still receiving disability payments while sitting in prison? The answer wasn't convincing. He insisted someone else was handling the checks as his representative payee. In his mind, that shifted the responsibility elsewhere. But responsibility doesn't disappear simply because you point at another person. As I listened, it became increasingly obvious that he was missing the central issue. When someone is incarcerated, the state provides housing. The state provides food. The state provides medical care. The state provides basic necessities. Taxpayers are already paying those costs. That's reality. Yet somehow he believed he should also benefit from disability payments during the same period. The logic simply didn't hold up. What surprised me most was what happened next. When I asked whether he had attempted to work while incarcerated, he explained that he had tried to obtain a prison job. Apparently there was a waiting list, and he had wanted to perform maintenance duties such as sweeping floors and cleaning. That answer opened a door he never expected. If he was physically capable of sweeping floors and performing labor inside prison, then naturally another question followed. Why couldn't he do similar work outside prison? The courtroom became noticeably quieter, because that question strikes at the heart of disability claims. The issue isn't whether a person prefers one type of work over another. The issue is whether they're capable of working. The more he spoke, the more obvious the contradiction became. At that moment, I realized the counterclaim had no chance. None. Not even close. He wanted reimbursement connected to disability checks that should never have continued while he was incarcerated in the first place. The idea made no sense. If taxpayers were already paying for his housing, meals, clothing, and medical care, then taxpayers shouldn't be expected to pay again through disability benefits. Once is enough. Twice is ridiculous. 3 times is outrageous. The more I examined the facts, the clearer the outcome became. The daughter deserved reimbursement for the utility debt that had followed her. The counterclaim, however, was another story entirely. It rested on a foundation that simply couldn't survive scrutiny. By the end of the case, the answer was obvious. The daughter had been burdened with expenses that rightfully belonged to someone else. The stepfather's attempt to recover disability money failed completely. And as I looked around the courtroom, I couldn't help thinking about a larger issue. Cases like this reveal something important. Government programs exist to help people who genuinely need assistance. But those programs are not designed to provide duplicate benefits when taxpayers are already covering every basic necessity. Common sense should never be controversial. Yet somehow, it often is. That day, the facts spoke louder than excuses. And when the facts are clear, my job is easy. What made this case even more fascinating wasn't the money itself, it was the pattern hidden underneath it. Over the years, I've seen countless family disputes enter my courtroom. Brothers suing brothers, sisters suing sisters, parents suing children, children suing parents. And while every case arrives wrapped in a different story, many of them share one thing in common. Someone believes family loyalty should excuse financial responsibility. That's exactly the feeling I began getting as this case unfolded. The daughter sitting before me wasn't acting like someone who wanted revenge. She wasn't trying to punish her mother. If anything, she looked exhausted. The kind of exhausted that doesn't come from a single argument or a single unpaid bill. It comes from years of carrying burdens that were never supposed to belong to you. As I reviewed the timeline again, the pieces started fitting together in a way that made the entire situation much more troubling. At some point, the daughter had agreed to help. Maybe she believed it would only be temporary. Maybe she thought her mother would get back on her feet quickly. Maybe she assumed the arrangement would end before it became a problem. But temporary arrangements have a funny habit of becoming permanent when nobody enforces boundaries. That's something I see all the time. 1 month turns into 3 months. 3 months turns into a year. Before long, nobody remembers where the original favor ended and the obligation began. And that's exactly how people find themselves trapped. The daughter had apparently tried to solve the problem peacefully. She eventually closed the account because she understood the risk. Every bill attached to her name had the potential to damage her financial future. Many young people don't fully appreciate that reality until it's too late. A utility account may seem insignificant. It's just electricity, just gas, just another monthly bill. But unpaid obligations don't stay small forever. They grow, they accumulate, they follow people, sometimes for years. A damaged credit history can affect where you live, what loans you qualify for, and how much you pay for basic necessities. The consequences can last long after the original debt is forgotten. That's why I paid very close attention to the daughter's actions. She wasn't simply complaining. She had actually taken steps to protect herself. She closed the account. That was a clear signal. It was her way of saying enough is enough. And yet somehow, the problem continued. That detail bothered me, because whenever someone tries to remove themselves from a financial obligation, and the obligation keeps returning, there's usually more to the story. I could sense that both sides were presenting carefully selected versions of events. That happens every day in court. People don't usually lie about everything. Instead, they tell 90% of the truth and hope the missing 10% goes unnoticed. But that missing 10% is often where the entire case lives. As the hearing continued, I found myself paying less attention to what people claimed and more attention to what their actions revealed. Actions tell the truth. Words merely compete for attention. The mother's explanation depended heavily on the idea that her daughter willingly agreed to help. Perhaps she did. But even if that were true, helping someone doesn't erase accountability. A favor is not a blank check. A favor doesn't transfer permanent responsibility. And a favor certainly doesn't mean another person should be left holding thousands of dollars in debt. That distinction matters. In healthy families, help flows in both directions. People support each other during difficult times. But support has limits. Once help begins causing harm to the person providing it, something has gone wrong. The daughter appeared to have reached that point long before this case arrived in my courtroom. And then there was the stepfather. His counterclaim created an entirely different layer of complexity. The more he spoke, the more I realized he viewed the situation through a lens of entitlement rather than responsibility. That's a dangerous perspective. Entitlement has a way of convincing people that every inconvenience deserves compensation. Responsibility asks a different question. What part of this situation belongs to me? That's the question mature adults ask themselves. Unfortunately, it wasn't the question I was hearing that day. Instead, I heard explanations. I heard excuses. I heard attempts to redirect blame. What I didn't hear was ownership. And ownership is everything. One of the most revealing moments came when we discussed his incarceration. The facts themselves weren't complicated. He had been in custody. His basic needs had been provided. His housing was covered. His meals were covered. His medical care was covered. Yet he still believed disability benefits should somehow continue as though none of that mattered. What fascinated me wasn't the legal argument. It was the mindset behind it. Because that mindset appears in many forms. People often focus on what they think they're owed while ignoring what they've already received. It's human nature. But courts don't operate on feelings. Courts operate on facts. And the facts here were impossible to ignore. As I listened, I noticed something else. Neither side seemed fully aware of how their decisions had compounded over time. Small choices create large consequences. A utility account left open too long. A bill left unpaid. A responsibility pushed onto someone else. A government agency left uninformed. Individually, each decision may appear minor. Together, they create a disaster. That's one of the most important lessons I wish more people understood. Financial problems rarely explode overnight. They grow quietly, silently, month after month, year after year, until one day they arrive in a courtroom. And by then, everyone wonders how things became so complicated. The truth is, they became complicated one decision at a time. As the hearing neared its conclusion, I looked again at the people standing before me. What struck me wasn't anger, it was disappointment. Families are supposed to provide security. They're supposed to make life easier. Yet too often, the deepest financial wounds come from the people closest to us. Not because they intend to cause harm, but because boundaries become blurred, expectations become unreasonable, and accountability disappears. The daughter had learned an expensive lesson. Helping family members without clear limits can carry consequences. The mother had learned a lesson as well. Good intentions don't erase debt. And the stepfather learned perhaps the hardest lesson of all. Responsibility cannot be outsourced. Not to family, not to government agencies, not to anyone. Eventually, every person must answer for their own decisions. By the time I reached my final ruling, I wasn't thinking about utility bills anymore. I wasn't thinking about disability payments. I wasn't even thinking about the specific dollar amounts. I was thinking about fairness. Because at its core, that's what every courtroom seeks. Fairness. Not perfection, not popularity. Fairness. And fairness required acknowledging a simple truth. The daughter had done more than enough. She had helped. She had waited. She had tolerated the situation longer than most people would have. At some point, helping had turned into being taken advantage of. That's where the line must be drawn. When the case finally ended, the legal issues were resolved. But the family issues were another matter entirely. Courtrooms can settle debts. They can issue judgments. They can determine responsibility. What they cannot do is repair trust. That part belongs to the people involved. Whether they choose to rebuild those relationships is entirely up to them. As they left the courtroom, I couldn't help reflecting on how often cases like this appear before me. Different names, different faces, different circumstances. Yet the same lesson appears again and again. Never assume that family obligations cancel financial obligations. Never assume that kindness removes accountability. And never assume that a temporary arrangement will remain temporary unless everyone involved clearly understands where the limits are. Because when those limits disappear, what begins as a favor can quickly become a lawsuit. And that's exactly how this family found themselves standing before me that day.